Joining us now from Newsmax Studios in New York is former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. He is the author of the New York Times best-selling memoir, Known and Unknown, an up-close and personal look at his half-century career in American politics. Known and Unknown spent 8 weeks on the Times bestsellers list and debuted at #1. Called the first political memoir of the information age, it is being released in paperback this week. And Secretary Rumsfeld, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
Well, the most significant development since the hardcover edition of Known and Unknown was published was the killing of Osama bin Laden. Subsequently, you wrote a new preface for the paperback version. How do you think bin Laden's killing will change how history views your tenure as Secretary of Defense?
Well, I really don't think of it in that sense, but it was an impressive accomplishment, and a great deal of credit should go to the men and women in our armed forces, and particularly in our special operations forces, and also, of course, in the intelligence community. We've had the ability to do that in terms of finishing the job, and the problem was gathering sufficient intelligence. I will say that I think the decision that was made by the Obama administration was the right decision. There are others who've speculated that maybe they should have just used cruise missiles and not run the risk of putting in the SEAL Team 6. My view is that they came out with intelligence, having gathered it on site, which would not have been able had they used cruise missiles. So I think that the correct decision was made. I should add, in direct answer to your question, that there's no way they could have done that. When we arrived in the administration in 2001, the capabilities that were used to kill Osama bin Laden, both intelligence and special operations forces, were investments that were made during the Bush administration, and each president has available to them only what's left by their predecessors. And this administration has been left in really truly impressive capabilities with respect to special operation forces. These are the finest warriors on the face of the earth.
Now, President Obama has made his decision to kill Osama bin Laden in the successful SEAL operation a campaign matter. Do you think it's okay for him to mention this on the campaign trail?
Oh, I think it's inevitable. What bothers me is not that it gets mentioned. What bothers me is the White House has been leaking out information about how we operate in the armed forces, and I would have to imagine that the people in the Department of Defense, the Special Operations Forces, are grinding their teeth, wishing that so many aspects of how they do what they do had not been leaked out, because it unquestionably will make more difficult our Special Operations Forces tasks in the future.
Mr. Secretary, in the book you note that the Department of Defense argued that the best way to get Syria to change its sponsorship of terrorists, pursuit of weapons of mass destruction, and sending jihadists into Iraq was to put pressure on the regime diplomatically. Now, after the massacre of more than 100 civilians this week in Syria, allegedly at the hands of the government, the U.S. and 7 other countries expelled Syrian diplomats from their capitals to pressure, diplomatically, the Assad regime to carry out the UN peace plan. Do you see this working? And after 13,000 have died in the uprising there, at what point should the international community step in with military action?
Well, of course, I'm sure the people in various governments are looking at the full range of options, from doing nothing to all the way over to using what you suggested, the use of ground forces in Syria. There are a lot of other options in between, and it's pretty clear that the Assad regime is tough. They're not eager to step away. Their desire is to perpetuate themselves in power. And they are brutal and repressive, and thus far have been successful in maintaining power. There are a lot of things that can be done in between the two extremes. Obviously, you can engage in covert action. You can do what we're now doing finally in withdrawing diplomats and putting economic pressure on Syria. There are still other things that could be done, as were done in Libya, for example, using air power. The problem is you don't know what is going to follow if, in fact, the Assad regime ends. It would be, in my view, a good thing for the Assad regime to end. It would not be a good thing to have a Muslim Brotherhood extreme Islamist government take over. So it is not a simple task that's facing the administration and other free nations, and they obviously are trying to gather intelligence and find their way.
Speaking of the Muslim Brotherhood, in mid-June, 2 Egyptian presidential candidates will face off in a runoff. What will Egypt's relationship with the U.S. be if the Muslim Brotherhood takes over control of that country?
Well, I guess it depends on what you mean by control. The control at the present time is divided. It includes the Egyptian military that have been an important stabilizing force in what is an enormously important country in that part of the world. I mean, here's Egypt with 60 million people, the fountain of education for the Arab world, a country that has a peace treaty with Israel, which has provided a stable situation since the time of Anwar Sadat. What the balance will be between the Egyptian military and the parliament, which now is about 73% on the extremist side. The Muslim Brotherhood combined with the Salafists, as I recall, have somewhere between 70 and 75% of the vote in the parliament. If they end up taking entire control of the country, the Muslim Brotherhood, I think that the relationship with Israel, the relationship with the United States, and the stabilizing influence that Egypt's played will be gone. If in fact that's not the case, that the Islamists win, and yet they maintain a relationship with the Egyptian military and come to some common understanding of how they will govern that is not going to be as extreme as one would think from the Salafists and the Muslim Brotherhood, then of course you would have a something in between, and it remains to be seen what the decision would be with respect to the Israeli peace treaty, for example.
There is concern among many that for democracy's sake, we are empowering Islamists in Tunisia, Libya, Egypt, and maybe soon in Syria. Are you concerned?
Indeed, I am. I think that the danger is that you've got a range of interests and factions and people. You have people who literally want a job and they're unemployed and they see television and they see Facebook and they understand that other countries have greater opportunities and they want to move towards a freer political or a freer economic system. And then you have the extremists and the radicals that are determined to impose a caliphate and their extreme views on everybody, not just the people in their countries. And as you go through these transitions in the northern African countries, it is not possible to foresee exactly how the balance will shake out. I served as President Reagan's Middle East envoy back in the 1980s and have spent a lot of time in that part of the world. And I think that anyone who thinks they know what the outcome is going to be probably is going to find that they're wrong. It is simply, once the cards go up in the air, it's not knowable as to exactly how they'll fall. What we do know is that the extremists tend to be the better organized, the more vicious, the more determined, even though they may be in a minority. And they know where they want to go, they're determined, whereas there's a range of other views as to what people in those various countries think. But if you look at the instability in Libya today, it's not clear how that's going to shake out. You have a bunch of factions and militias in a country with a lot of wealth, a lot of oil, and it's not written. We don't know what it would be in Syria. We don't know what's going to eventually evolve in Tunisia. Clearly we don't know how Egypt will evolve, except we know that the turmoil offers opportunities to various factions, some of which are better organized than others.
Mr. Secretary, a drone strike killed 17 in Yemen the other day. The deadly use of drones has become a key tactic in fighting the war on terrorism. However, some are raising legal and ethical questions about extrajudicial killings, particularly when it involves American citizens. What is your view of this controversial tactic?
I think the use of drones is a good thing. Pilotless aircraft, armed or unarmed, have added a dimension of capability to the United States that other nations don't have. They also have the advantage of putting fewer American lives at risk, which is certainly something that is very much in our interest. I think that what you suggested is here it's been announced that we have a president of the United States who sits in the Oval Office and is targeting individuals in other countries to be killed. There's no question, but during the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson did some targeting. I've never believed that having the President of the United States engaged in specific targeting is a particularly good idea. They're not trained for it. They need to establish policy and then allow the responsible military officials or CIA officials to actually undertake the decision-making on specific targets. The legality questions, of course, are something that will be ultimately resolved in the courts. But the criticism that was heaped on, for example, Guantanamo Bay and the detention of people, clearly, compared to going out and targeted killings, is the care that Guantanamo Bay is a very well-run prison. It's one of the best-run prisons on the face of the earth. And people are not killed there, and they're not tortured, and they're detained and kept off the battlefield because we don't want them going out and killing more innocent men, women, and children. Killing people has the advantage that they're gone. It also has the disadvantage that President Obama has to accept, and that is that if you use drone strikes, you don't have the advantage of going in and gathering intelligence information, which is enormously important. And in case of Osama bin Laden, by going in and bringing out the intelligence information, we improved our knowledge of how they're operating, who's doing what, where they are, what their techniques and procedures are, and that's an advantage. So there's a balance there. How the courts will ultimately sort all this out, I don't have the vaguest idea.
Let's turn to Russia. President Obama pushed through New START, bringing strategic nuclear forces to 1,500 on both the U.S. and Russian sides. There have been reports the Obama administration is mulling a unilateral cut, maybe drawing down strategic forces to 300 weapons. Do you like this idea?
No, I don't. I think he's making a serious mistake. The idea that we are going to live in a nuclear-free world, it seems to me, is a reach. And George Washington said that the way to avoid war is to prepare for war, to be capable. Dwight Eisenhower said peace through strength. And I think the idea of unilateral disarmament is not a good idea, and I think it's a mistaken notion. I believe, and I believe history shows, that weakness is provocative. To the extent that the United States is seen as healthy and capable from an economic standpoint, to the extent the United States is seen as capable from a military standpoint, the world will be a more stable and a safer place. To the extent the United States is seen as a weak country from an economic standpoint or from a military standpoint, the world will be less safe. People will be encouraged to do things they wouldn't even think of doing if they saw the United States playing a responsible role in contributing to peace and stability.
Now, under the debt ceiling budget deal, Congress agreed to automatic cuts to the defense budget if no future budget agreements are made. Do you see this as a good thing?
No. What's happening there is that they've already agreed to something like $500 billion in cuts from the Defense Department over the coming decade. Under the sequestration, I think it's another $500 to $700 billion. That gets you to $1 trillion to $1.2 trillion of cuts in the defense establishment. This has been done after every major conflict in my lifetime, after World War II, after Vietnam, Korea, after the Cold War, and we always paid a penalty. And people can say, well, we paid a penalty, to be sure, but we survived. We're still around. And I would caution, I don't think we can make this same mistake again. The reason I don't is because the weapons, the lethality of weapons today is vastly different than it was back in the end of World War II or even the end of the Cold War. When the Bush administration came into office in 2001, Our intelligence had been drawn down. Our defense capabilities had been drawn down. There's no way in the world this current administration would be able to do what they can do today had the Bush administration not significantly increased our special operations forces, their equipment, their authorities, improved the intelligence capabilities of the United States of America, and made those investments. It had to be done. The Bush administration did it, and the Obama administration and the country and the world are benefiting from those capabilities. When I went to Washington, we were spending in 10% of gross domestic product on defense back in the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson years. Today we're down to 4% plus or minus of gross domestic product. So the budget problems we face do not come from the defense establishment. They come from the entitlements, and that's where we're going to have to go if we're going to maintain the economic strength of our country.
Secretary Rumsfeld, when it comes to dealing with a threat of a nuclear Iran, President Obama has utilized diplomacy and now sanctions on Iran with very little, if any, impact. Do you think that either Israel or the U.S. will strike Iran? And do you think President Obama has handled the situation well?
Well, no. I think what you see with respect to North Korea and Iran is a behavior pattern by the United States and indeed by the international community, to the extent that the international nations are a community, which they're really not. What you see is a behavior pattern that keeps repeating itself despite the fact that that same behavior has failed previously. And the odds of Iran or North Korea ultimately acquiescing and acceding to the UN requirements for inspections or discontinuing their nuclear programs, I think are down close to zero. And I think people who keep writing in the press and contending that they have a possible breakthrough coming up and one more meeting might just do it, those regimes are vicious dictatorships that are going to get up every morning and say, what do we have to do to perpetuate ourselves in power? And they've decided that having nuclear weapons is an important element of perpetuating themselves in power and being factors in the world scene. And therefore, I do not see them discontinuing their efforts. I don't see China putting pressure on North Korea. I don't see Russia putting pressure on Iran. They're closely cooperated.
Do you think that either Israel or the U.S. will strike Iran, though?
Well, I think the likelihood of the United States doing so is something that I'm really not in a position to judge. I'm not a part of that administration. I do think that from the standpoint of Israel, given the public statements repeatedly that the goal that Israel does not have a right to exist on the face of the earth, that the authorities, the Ayatollahs in Iran, believe that it should be eradicated or incinerated. I think that Israel, any leader in Israel, is going to have a very tough decision. With a country that small, with a population that small, knowing that a country that is determined to have the state of Israel not exist, having a nuclear weapon, is something that I would think that is beyond the tolerance level of Israeli leadership. And I would suspect that if the intelligence evolves in a way that they decide that they're at risk, that they would have really no other choice.
Former Vice President Dick Cheney wrote in his book that he pushed for an attack on Iran, but President Bush and other national security advisors opposed him. He was outvoted, so to speak. Had you been in the government at the time, would you have supported such an attack?
I wasn't there. I don't know what the facts were, and I've got a lot of respect for the people making those decisions, and they're difficult decisions. I must say that the world is a better place for the fact that Israel, years ago, went in and took out the Iraqi nuclear capability. The world's a better place that the Israelis went in and took out the Syrian nuclear capability. And I think that the prospect of Iran with a determined set of leaders who are attempting to impose their view of the world in the region and elsewhere, having a nuclear weapon is a dangerous thing. And certainly I would hope that the United States would would be supportive of whatever Israel decided to do. On the other hand, if you see the relationship between the United States and Israel at the present time, I would think Israel's in a somewhat awkward position because the opinions that come out of Washington, D.C. and the White House and this administration have not been friendly to Israel.
Last night, GOP presidential candidate Mitt Romney secured enough delegates to clinch the GOP nomination. Who do you think he should tap as his running mate?
I don't have any idea. I think he'll sit down with a lot of interesting, smart people, and they'll try to think it through and find a way to get enough electoral votes to be elected president, and make sure that whoever it is someone that he believes in his heart is capable of serving as president, because it's an important first political decision of a presidential nominee. And we've seen over the decades some mistakes made in selecting vice presidents, and in both parties. And he will be judged by the way he does it and who he selects. And the American people will have to nod and feel, well, that's sensible, that person does have the ability to serve as president in an emergency.
Do you think that CIA Director General David Petraeus would make a good vice president?
Oh my goodness, he's never been involved in politics. He's never been tested in that regard. I don't think that's a possibility.
All right, last question real quickly, Mr. Secretary. You are donating your proceeds from the sales of known and unknown to military charities supported by the Rumsfeld Foundation. Talk to us about the military charities you're supporting and the impact you hope to have on those who will benefit.
Well, I've got such enormous respect for the men and women in uniform and for what they've done and the fact that they've raised their hand and volunteered and said, send me. My father served in the Navy in World War II. I served in the Navy as a Navy pilot. I've been out talking about my book and doing book signings, and I've been to, I think, 15 or 16, 17 different military bases, and I've been able to thank them. And one of the charities we've given to, I suppose, 15 or 20 different military charities that support the men and women in uniform. They support veterans, they support the families, and they support the families of the fallen. The important thing, it seems to me, is to recognize how grateful the American people are to those who defend our country. And I find it, over the spread of my lifetime, I've now lived a third of our country's history, and I've seen the situation in this country where we've not been as supportive of the military as we are today. And I think it's in large measure because it's a volunteer military. And everyone knows that everyone serving there is there because they want to be there and they want to serve this country and they care about the country. So I hope people will look up some military charities and find a way to be helpful.
All right, again, the book is Known and Unknown, now available on paperback on Amazon.com and in bookstores everywhere. Secretary Rumsfeld, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, enjoyed it.
And thank you for watching Newsmax TV.